December 1944, Nancy, France. A muddy supply road 40 miles from the German border. A white first lieutenant raises his boot and kicks a clump of frozen mud directly at the polished boots of a black second lieutenant. Then he spits. A thick, deliberate stream of tobacco juice splatters across the black officer's sleeve, soaking into the fabric inches from the gold bar on his shoulder. The white lieutenant smirks. He turns his back. He walks away without saluting. He has just made the worst mistake of his military career. Because 300 yards down that same road, a jeep is approaching. And inside that jeep sits a four-star general with ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, a temper that could melt the armor off a Sherman tank, and an obsession with one thing above all others: discipline. His name is George Smith Patton, Jr., and he has just seen everything. What happens in the next 90 seconds will travel through the Third Army faster than any battlefield dispatch. It will reach foxholes in the Ardennes. It will reach field hospitals in Luxembourg. It will reach black tank crews who have been waiting 2 years for anyone with stars on his collar to do what Patton is about to do. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more incredible stories, historic events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our growing community of history lovers. The black officer is a tank platoon leader. His name is recorded in unit rosters, but lost to most history books. His battalion is the 761st, the Black Panthers. And the story of what happens on this muddy road and what these men go on to do in the 7 months that follow will rewrite everything the United States Army thought it knew about who could fight, who could lead, and who deserved to be saluted. By May 1945, this single battalion will have fought 183 consecutive days in combat, destroyed over 30 enemy tanks, knocked out 163 machine gun nests, captured 30 towns, and done it all while the army that sent them to die spent every available bureaucratic hour trying to prove they couldn't. But on this cold morning, none of that has happened yet. On this cold morning, there is only a stained sleeve, a smirking lieutenant, and the sound of a jeep braking hard in the mud. To understand why what is about to happen matters so much, you have to understand the world the black soldier of 1944 actually lived in. Not the recruiting posters, not the speeches about the 4 freedoms. The real world. The United States Army in 1944 was segregated, officially, legally, structurally. Black soldiers trained in separate camps, slept in separate barracks, ate in separate mess halls, and shipped overseas in separate transport groups. The War Department had internal studies dating back to 1925 that referred to Negro troops in clinical dismissive language. The 1925 War College Report had concluded in writing that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the initiative for armored warfare. That document was nearly 20 years old. It was still shaping policy. The 761st Tank Battalion had been activated in April 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. They trained for 2 years. While white armor units cycled through Fort Knox and shipped to North Africa, to Sicily, to Normandy, the 761st waited. The Army found reason after reason to delay them, reassign them, question whether they could even operate a 34-ton Sherman tank. Sergeant Horace Evans, a gunner from Georgia, said it plainly years later. They trained knowing the Army was looking for any excuse to keep them out of the war. They gave it none. In October 1944, General Patton personally requested them. He needed armor. He needed it fast. The Third Army was bleeding tank crews in the Lorraine campaign, and Patton did not have the luxury of caring about the color of the men inside the Shermans. He cared whether the Shermans moved, but requesting the unit was one thing. Protecting them inside the institution that had spent 2 years insulting them, that was something else entirely. And the men of the 761st knew it, because they had already lived through it. But everything was about to change because of one man riding in a jeep with mud on his boots and 4 stars on his collar. George S. Patton, Jr. was 60 years old in December 1944. He had been a soldier for 40 of them. He had chased Pancho Villa through Mexico in 1916. He had commanded tanks at Saint-Mihiel in 1918. He had been shot, gassed, decorated, demoted, promoted, and nearly fired by Eisenhower twice. He carried 2 pistols. He cursed like a stevedore. He believed with absolute conviction that he had been a soldier in previous lives, including under Caesar at the Rubicon. He was not by any honest measure a racial progressive. His diaries contained statements about black soldiers that reflected the worst prejudices of his Virginia upbringing. He had publicly questioned more than once whether Negro troops could be trusted in combat under fire. And yet, Patton understood one thing with absolute granite, unshakable clarity. An army runs on discipline. Discipline runs on hierarchy. Hierarchy runs on rank. And rank, the moment it becomes negotiable, ceases to exist. Once a single officer can decide which lieutenants deserve a salute and which do not, the entire structure of military authority begins to dissolve from the inside. Patton had seen what happened to armies that lost discipline. He had studied them. The French in 1917. The Russians in 1917. The Italians at Caporetto. He had built his entire command philosophy around one principle. The code applies to everyone all the time, without exception, or it applies to no one. That morning, riding through Lorraine in his open Jeep with the wind cutting through his leather coat, Patton saw a white lieutenant fail to salute a black lieutenant. And every fiber of 40 years of soldiering told him exactly what that meant. It meant the code was being rewritten on the side of the road by a junior officer who thought his skin gave him the authority to amend the United States Uniform Code of Military Justice. Patton was about to disabuse him of that idea in front of every soldier within earshot. What Patton was about to do had no precedent in the European theater of operations. None. There was no order from Eisenhower instructing senior commanders to publicly enforce salute protocol across racial lines. There was no War Department directive. There was no Inspector General memorandum. The matter had been left deliberately in the gray zone where the segregated army preferred to leave it. Quiet. Unaddressed. Absorbed. Refusing to salute a superior officer was a court-martial offense under Article of War 75. Every soldier knew it. Every officer knew it. And every officer also knew by 1944 that when the offended party was black, the offense was almost never prosecuted. Reports were misplaced. Witnesses became unavailable. Commanding officers found reasons to let it slide. The institutional message was unmistakable. Black officers held rank on paper. The actual recognition of that rank was negotiable. This was the system Patton was about to detonate. The Jeep slowed. Patton's driver, Master Sergeant John Mims, who had been with the general since North Africa, knew the body language. He had seen it before Casablanca. He had seen it before Sicily. The general's shoulders going rigid, the jaw setting, the fingers tightening on the leather strap of the door. Mims braked without being told. Patton stepped out. His boots hit the frozen mud with a sound that several witnesses, including 2 black enlisted men from a quartermaster detachment who happened to be unloading crates 15 yards away, said they remembered for the rest of their lives. He did not run. He did not shout from a distance. He walked, slowly, deliberately. The kind of walk a man uses when he wants the entire world to understand that he has all the time he needs. The white lieutenant turned. He saw the 4 stars. The blood drained from his face so fast that one witness later described him as going the color of wet paper. The black lieutenant stood absolutely still. He did not know yet what was about to happen. He had been on the receiving end of this kind of insult dozens of times since being commissioned. He had learned to absorb it, to file it, to keep moving. Saying anything, doing anything, would only make him the problem. That was the rule. That was how it worked. He was about to learn that on this particular morning with this particular general, the rule had just been suspended. Patton stopped 4 feet from the white lieutenant. He did not raise his voice. Not yet. According to multiple accounts reconstructed from witness testimony in the years after the war, his first words were quiet, almost conversational, the kind of quiet that makes experienced soldiers reach instinctively for cover. He asked the lieutenant if he had just walked past a commissioned officer of the United States Army without rendering the appropriate salute. The lieutenant tried to answer. He stammered. He began some explanation involving the chain of command, the supply line, the urgency of his task. Patton let him talk for approximately 7 seconds. Then he raised one gloved hand, and the lieutenant stopped talking, as if a switch had been thrown. What Patton said next would echo through the Third Army for the rest of the war, and be repeated by veterans of the 761st for the rest of their lives. He told the lieutenant that the gold bar on the other officer's shoulder had been issued by the same United States Army that had issued his own. That the oath the black lieutenant had taken was identical word for word to the oath he had taken. That the Uniform Code of Military Justice did not contain a single sentence clause or footnote authorizing any officer to choose which superiors to salute based on the color of their skin. And then Patton ordered him to salute. Now, in front of every soldier on that road. The lieutenant's hand came up so fast it was almost a blur. But Patton was not finished. Because what came next was the part that mattered most. The part that traveled. The part that would still be told around campfires in the Ardennes 2 weeks later, when those same men were dying to break through to Bastogne. And in part 2, you will see exactly how that single frozen moment on a muddy road in Lorraine would ignite a fire across the entire Third Army, a fire that would carry the Black Panthers through the Battle of the Bulge, through the Siegfried Line, and into a war record that the United States government would spend the next 53 years trying to officially acknowledge. But would Patton's Defiant Act be enough to change an army built on segregation? Or would the system swallow this moment the way it had swallowed every moment before it? The answer is coming. And it begins with a sergeant named Reuben Rivers, an Oklahoma farm boy with a Sherman tank and a wound that should have killed him, who was about to do something near a French village called Gibling that would haunt the United States Army for half a century. In part 1, you saw a 4-star general step out of his jeep on a frozen Lorraine road and force a white lieutenant to render the salute he had refused to give a black officer of equal commission. You saw George S. Patton Jr. enforce the Uniform Code with the same fury he aimed at Rommel's ghost. The salute was given. The jeep drove away. The story began traveling through the Third Army at the speed of rumor. But what most history books leave out is what happened in the 72 hours that followed. Because enforcing one salute on one road was the easy part. Protecting an entire black armored battalion inside an institution that had spent 2 years trying to keep them out of combat. That was the war Patton was about to lose. And here is where everything got worse. The opposition had a name. Major General Edward Brooks, commander of the 2nd Armored Division, career cavalry officer, West Point class of 1916, and on paper, one of the most respected armor commanders in the European theater of operations. Brooks had read the same 1925 War College report Patton had read. The difference was that Brooks believed it. Every word. Brooks was not alone. Inside 12th Army Group, a quiet faction of senior officers had been working since October 1944 to ensure the 761st Tank Battalion was assigned exclusively to rear area duties. Supply convoy escort, road security, anything but front-line armored combat. Their reasoning was wrapped in the polite language of staff officers, but the substance was unmistakable. They did not believe black tankers could perform under sustained fire. The pressure on Patton was enormous. The Lorraine campaign had cost the Third Army over 50,000 casualties since September. Replacement crews were arriving with as little as 8 weeks of training. German Panther tanks were chewing through American armor at a kill ratio approaching 3-to-1 in some sectors. Every functioning Sherman mattered. Every trained crew mattered. And yet a coordinated effort was underway on paper in triplicate through proper channels to bench an entire battalion of trained tankers because of the color of the men inside the turrets. The confrontation came in early November 1944 inside a stone farmhouse near St. Nicolas-de-Port that the Third Army was using as a forward command post. Witnesses included 2 staff colonels and a signals officer. Brooks made his case. The 761st was untested. Their training, while technically complete, had been conducted under instructors who, in Brooks' words, may not have applied the same standards. Patton listened. Then he stood up. According to Colonel Paul Harkins, his deputy chief of staff Patton said, "I don't give a damn what color they are. I want to know if they can kill Germans, and nobody in this room has given them the chance to prove it." Brooks pushed back. Patton cut him off. The meeting ended with Patton's order recorded in Third Army operational logs. The 761st would deploy to active combat with the 26th Infantry Division, effective immediately. Anyone who interfered would answer to him personally. But Patton's order was only the beginning. He needed an ally inside the command structure who could shield the battalion from the slow bureaucratic strangulation that had killed black combat units before. And he found one in the most unexpected place. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates was a 35-year-old white officer from New Jersey. He had been the commanding officer of the 761st since 1943. And unlike most white officers assigned to black units, Bates had refused multiple opportunities to transfer out. When asked why, he gave the same answer every time. "These are my men. I trained them. I will fight with them." Bates had spent 2 years documenting every gunnery score, every maneuver result, every training metric his battalion had achieved. He arrived at Patton's headquarters carrying a leather binder containing the data. The 761st had achieved gunnery accuracy ratings that exceeded the average for white armored battalions by 17%. Their cross-country maneuver times were faster. Their mechanical reliability scores were higher. Patton looked at the binder. He looked at Bates. He said, "Colonel, you have my full authority. Use it." The plan that emerged was simple in concept and brutal in execution. The 761st would be thrown into the heaviest fighting available. Not eased in, not tested in light contact. Dropped directly into the meat grinder of the Sare Basin offensive. Patton's logic was cold but clear. If they performed under maximum pressure, no one in the entire United States Army would ever again question whether black tankers could fight. If they failed, no protection in the world would save them. There would be one chance. The day arrived. November 8, 1944. Morville-les-Vicq. The 761st Tank Battalion rolled forward into combat for the first time in American history as a black armored unit in front-line action. The weather was atrocious. Cold rain had turned the Lorraine clay into glue that gripped tank treads and pulled them sideways. Visibility was under 400 yards. German positions dug into the high ground included anti-tank guns, mortar pits, and infantry in well-prepared trenches. The 26th Infantry Division had been bleeding for 6 days trying to take Morville. Captain David Williams of a company gave the order. Shermans of the 761st advanced in textbook formation machine guns, sweeping the tree lines. Within the first 90 seconds, German anti-tank fire erupted from a concealed position to the right. The lead tank, commanded by Sergeant Roy King, took a hit that sheared off a road wheel. King kept firing. His gunner, Corporal Henry Conway, scored a direct hit on the German gun position at 600 yards. What happened next astonished every observer present, including a skeptical lieutenant colonel from Brooks' staff, who had been sent specifically to document failures. The 761st did not break. They did not retreat. They executed bounding overwatch by platoon exactly as doctrine prescribed, while taking continuous fire from 3 sides. By 1400 hours, Morville-les-Vicq had fallen. The 761st had destroyed 4 anti-tank guns, 3 machine gun nests, and supported the capture of over 200 German prisoners. Their own losses were 1 tank disabled, 3 crewmen wounded, 0 killed. The lieutenant colonel from Brooks' headquarters returned to division with a written assessment that contradicted everything his commanding general had predicted. The 761st had performed in his exact words, to a standard equal to or exceeding any white armored battalion observed in this sector. That report would be quietly buried for 33 years. But the soldiers on the ground knew. Word traveled. The 26th Infantry, who had bled for Morville, sent a delegation of riflemen across the muddy field that night to thank the tank crews personally. Several of those riflemen were from Mississippi and Alabama. The handshakes happened anyway. The cigarettes were shared anyway. War had a way of rewriting prejudice when survival was the currency. The Germans had a different reaction. Confusion, then alarm. Captured intelligence documents from the 11th Panzer Division in late November 1944 reference an unusually aggressive American armored battalion operating in the Sarre sector with tactical coordination that had caught their forward observers off guard. The Germans did not know the unit was black. They only knew that its tanks did not behave according to predicted American patterns. The 761st kept advancing. Vic-sur-Seine, Marsal, Dues, town after town fell to the combined infantry armor assault. By December 5, 1944, the battalion had been in continuous combat for nearly a month. They had earned their place. The system that had tried to keep them in the rear had been overruled by their own performance under fire. But the war was about to deliver a test no one had seen coming. On December 16, 1944, 18 German divisions punched through the Ardennes forest in the largest surprise offensive of the Western Front. 3 American divisions collapsed in the first 48 hours. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne. And Patton, in the most famous staff briefing of the war, promised Eisenhower he could turn his entire army 90 degrees in 72 hours and drive north to break the siege. The 761st was about to be hurled into the worst winter Europe had seen in 40 years. Sub-zero temperatures, frozen fuel lines, German Tiger tanks dug in across every road, and waiting for them in a snow-covered field outside a French village called Gabling was a moment that would define the entire battalion forever. A wounded sergeant named Reuben Rivers refusing evacuation. A German anti-tank gun zeroed on his turret. And a decision that would cost him his life and earn him a Medal of Honor that the United States Army would refuse to grant for the next 53 years. The real war was just beginning. In Part 1, you saw General Patton enforce a single salute on a frozen Lorraine road. In Part 2, you watched the 761st Tank Battalion shatter every prediction at Morville-les-Vicq, taking towns, capturing prisoners, and earning their place in the Third Army through fire and steel. They had proven they could fight. Now they were about to prove they could win battles that white commanders had said were impossible. Because as December 1944 closed, 18 German divisions were tearing through the Ardennes forest in the largest surprise offensive of the entire Western Front. 3 American divisions had collapsed. The 101st Airborne was surrounded at Bastogne, and the German High Command had made one fatal calculation. They believed American armor could not move fast enough in winter conditions to relieve the siege. They were about to learn how wrong they were, and the unit that would prove them wrong was the one the United States Army had spent 2 years trying to keep out of combat. This was no longer an experiment. This was the war. The German reaction to the Third Army's December breakthrough was immediate and panicked. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had assumed based on standard logistical calculations that any American relief force from the south would require a minimum of 9 days to reorient and advance. His staff had built the entire timing of the Bastogne encirclement around that assumption. Patton did it in 72 hours. German intelligence officers attached to the 5th Panzer Army began filing increasingly alarmed reports. American armored units were appearing in sectors where they were not supposed to be. They were moving at night. They were attacking through terrain considered impassable for Sherman tanks. General Major Heinz Kokott, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division at Bastogne, recorded in his post-war debriefing that he had encountered an American tank battalion of unusual aggression, pushing up from the south through Tillet and Romagny. His division took 1,200 casualties in 4 days, trying to hold a sector that staff planners had estimated could be defended for 2 weeks. Kokott did not know the unit was black. He knew only that its tanks did not stop when they should have stopped. They did not pull back when they took fire. They kept coming. By December 28th, the relief had broken through. Bastogne was open. The 101st Airborne had survived, and the 761st Tank Battalion had moved further faster and through worse conditions than any battalion in the entire Third Army during the pivot. 1,200 kilometers traveled in roughly 2 weeks, through ice mud and continuous German contact, but the cost was about to come due. The technical problems hit hard in early January 1945. Sherman tanks had not been designed for sustained operations in sub-zero temperatures. Fuel lines froze. Engine oil thickened to the consistency of tar. Tracks threw pins on iced roads and had to be rehung in open fields under harassing artillery fire. The 761st lost more tanks to mechanical breakdown in 2 weeks than they had lost to enemy fire in 2 months. And the political pressure inside 12th Army Group was building again. Casualty reports filtering back to the rear echelons showed the 761st had taken nearly 30% crew losses since November. The same officers who had tried to block their deployment in October were now arguing in carefully worded memos that the unit should be pulled from the line and reassigned to less demanding duties. The official language was concern for the men. The actual subtext was unmistakable. The system wanted them out. Then came Tillet. Then came Bougainville. Then came the moment that would define the entire battalion forever. The date was November 19, 1944. The location was a snow-covered field outside the French village of Gebling in the Sarre Basin sector. The unit was Company A of the 761st attached to the 26th Infantry Division for the Sarre offensive. The man at the center of what was about to happen was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, 26 years old, an Oklahoma sharecropper's son, who had enlisted in 1942 and trained for 2 years to command a Sherman tank. The morning began with a roadblock. German engineers had felled trees across the approach to Gebling, mining the obstacle and zeroing in artillery on the choke point. The 26th Infantry could not advance. Casualties were mounting. The attack was stalling. Rivers did not wait for orders. He climbed out of his tank. Under direct mortar fire, he attached a steel cable to one of the felled trees. He did this 3 times. 3 trees. 3 trips into the open while German rounds cratered the snow around him. His tank then dragged the obstacles clear. The road opened. The infantry advanced. That afternoon near Gebling, his Sherman struck a mine. The explosion ripped open Rivers' right leg from the knee down. The wound was severe, bone visible, bleeding heavy. The battalion surgeon examining him at the aid station ordered immediate evacuation. Rivers refused. He took morphine. He climbed into a different tank. He went back into the line. For the next 3 days, Sergeant Rivers commanded his tank with a wound that should have killed him. He led his platoon through Gebling. He directed fire on German positions at Borgaltroff. He continued to refuse evacuation each time it was offered. His company commander, Captain David Williams, would later testify under oath that Rivers told him directly, "Captain, you'll need me. I'm staying." On the morning of November 19th near Bugakov, the German anti-tank battery opened fire from a concealed position 800 meters away. Rivers spotted the muzzle flash. He had a choice: pull back into the tree line, or advance and engage to draw fire away from the rest of the company. He advanced. His Sherman fired 3 rounds at the German position before the return shot came. An 88mm armor-piercing shell struck the turret directly. Rivers was killed instantly. His gunner was wounded. His loader survived. The German gun was destroyed 40 seconds later by another tank in the platoon, alerted by Rivers' fire to the exact location. Captain Williams submitted Sergeant Reuben Rivers for the Medal of Honor on November 30th, 1944. The recommendation was processed through 3rd Army Headquarters. It was forwarded to higher command, and then it disappeared into the same bureaucratic machinery that had been designed for decades to ensure that no black soldier received the nation's highest military decoration. Rivers received the Silver Star instead, awarded posthumously, quietly, without fanfare. The Medal of Honor recommendation would sit untouched for 53 years. But news of what Rivers had done traveled. Inside the 761st, inside the 26th Infantry, inside Patton's headquarters. The story of the sergeant who refused evacuation, who fought for 3 days on a shattered leg, who advanced into 88mm fire to save his platoon, became part of the battalion's identity overnight. Men who had wavered hardened. Men who had doubted their own courage found something to anchor it to. The 761st kept fighting. Through January, through February, through the Siegfried Line in March, through the Rhine crossing in April, through the link-up with Soviet forces in May at the Steyr River in Austria. By the end of the war, the cumulative tally was staggering. 183 consecutive days in combat. 30 enemy tanks destroyed. 163 machine gun nests eliminated. 30 towns and villages liberated. Over 100,000 enemy soldiers killed, wounded, or captured during operations the battalion participated in. Their own casualties totaled 296 men, 36 killed in action, the rest wounded or evacuated. The Germans never broke their lines, not once. In 183 days of fighting, no German unit ever pushed the 761st Tank Battalion out of a position they had been ordered to hold. The military significance was undeniable. The official recognition was another matter entirely. The Presidential Unit citation that the 761st had earned in combat by April 1945 was not awarded until 1978. 33 years late. The Medal of Honor for Reuben Rivers was not awarded until 1997. 53 years late. President Bill Clinton presented it personally to Rivers' surviving sister Grace Woodfork in a White House ceremony attended by aging veterans of the battalion who had waited their entire lives for the United States government to acknowledge what they had done. The fighting had been finished on time. The recognition had not. But the men of the 761st had changed something the United States Army could not undo. They had proven in steel and blood across half a continent that the segregated structure of the American military rested on a lie that battlefield performance had demolished. President Truman would integrate the armed forces by executive order in July 1948. The 761st was not the only reason. But they were one of the reasons that mattered most. The story, however, was not finished, because the men who had won this victory were about to come home to a country that had not yet decided to honor them. A country where Reuben Rivers' Medal of Honor would sit in a filing cabinet for 2 generations. Where Warren Creasy's heroism would still be unrecognized today, and where one general's enforcement of a single salute on a frozen road in Lorraine had begun something that the United States Army would spend the next 80 years still trying to finish. This story has one final chapter, and it is the one almost no one knows. Across 3 parts, you have followed the journey. From a single salute enforced on a frozen Lorraine road by General George S. Patton, Jr. to the 761st Tank Battalion, shattering every prediction at Morville-le-Vicq, to Sergeant Reuben Rivers, refusing evacuation with a shattered leg and dying in his Sherman tank near Gebling. You watched men. The United States Army had spent 2 years trying to keep out of combat, fight 183 consecutive days, and break German lines that staff officers said they could never break. But what happened to the man behind the salute? What happened to the men he protected? And what happened to the Medal of Honor recommendation that disappeared into a filing cabinet for half a century? Because success as the survivors of the 761st would learn sometimes comes with a price the country is unwilling to pay. George S. Patton, Jr. did not live to see what he had started. On December 9, 1945, 7 months after the German surrender, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when his vehicle collided with a 2.5-ton truck at low speed. The impact threw him forward. His neck snapped. He survived the initial injury, but was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, he died of a pulmonary embolism in a military hospital. He was 60 years old. He never saw the executive order that would integrate the armed forces. He never read the Presidential Unit citation that would be awarded to the 761st 33 years later. He never lived to learn that Reuben Rivers, the sergeant from his 3rd Army, would finally receive the Medal of Honor. The men of the 761st came home to a country that had not changed. Sergeant Warren Creasy, the man his crewmates called the baddest man in the Army, returned to Texas. He was denied entry to whites-only restaurants while still in his decorated uniform. He stayed in the Army. He served 20 more years. He retired as a chief warrant officer in 1965. He died in 1976 without receiving the Medal of Honor that multiple commanders, including white officers who had witnessed his actions, had recommended for him. His case is still open. Petitions for his recognition continue to this day. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white commanding officer who had refused to abandon his men, fought the Army for the next 33 years to get the Presidential Unit Citation his battalion had earned in combat. The citation was finally awarded by President Jimmy Carter on January 24, 1978. Bates was 70 years old at the ceremony. He stood with the surviving veterans of his battalion, many of them in their 60s, and accepted the recognition that should have been given in 1945. He died in 1995, still advocating for the men he had commanded 50 years earlier. Grace Woodfork, Reuben Rivers' younger sister, received her brother's Medal of Honor from President Bill Clinton on January 13, 1997. She was 80 years old. She had spent her entire adult life waiting for her country to acknowledge what her brother had done in a field outside Gebling. She held the medal in both hands. She wept. But the deepest legacy of these men was never going to be measured in medals. The combat performance of the 761st Tank Battalion, along with the 92nd Infantry Division, the Tuskegee Airmen, and other black combat units in Europe and the Pacific, became the empirical foundation that made segregation in the armed forces statistically and morally indefensible. President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, ordering the integration of the United States military. The order cited equality of treatment and opportunity for all members of the armed forces without regard to race. The studies that supported it included after-action analysis of black combat units whose performance had matched or exceeded white units in identical conditions. Truman's order preceded the Civil Rights Movement by years. It preceded Brown versus Board of Education by 6 years. It preceded the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by 16 years. The military, the same institution that had tried to keep the 761st in rear area duties, became one of the first major American institutions to formally integrate. By the Korean War, just 2 years later, black and white soldiers were fighting in the same units. By Vietnam, integrated combat formations were standard. The principle that Patton enforced on a single muddy road in 1944, that rank applies to everyone wearing it, became national policy 4 years later. The numbers tell the rest of the story. Over 3 million African Americans have served in the integrated United States Armed Forces since 1948. Hundreds of thousands have held command positions. Generals, admirals, a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a Secretary of State, who began his career as a young black officer in an army that, when his father served, would not have allowed him to command white troops. The institutional transformation that began with units like the 761st reshaped not just the military, but the country that military served. But the largest lesson of this story has nothing to do with technology or tactics or even policy. It has to do with what happens when authority chooses enforcement over convenience on a small occasion in front of witnesses without waiting to be asked. Patton did not deliver a speech. He did not file a report. He did not convene a hearing. He saw a violation of the code, and he corrected it in real time in public with the full weight of the 4 stars on his collar. Every soldier who witnessed it received a message that no memorandum could have delivered with the same force. The code applies to everyone. Now, systems do not correct themselves. They correct when individuals with authority choose to enforce the rules they were sworn to uphold. The history of every institutional reform in the modern era confirms it. The breakthrough never comes from the system. It comes from a single decision-maker in a single moment refusing to let one more violation pass. And there is one final detail that almost no one knows. In 1997, when President Clinton presented the Medal of Honor to Reuben Rivers' family, the citation was based on a recommendation that had been written in November 1944 by Captain David Williams, the white company commander who had served with Rivers in the 761st. Williams had submitted the recommendation. He had watched it disappear. And for the next 53 years until the day he died in 1996 at the age of 76, Williams had refused to let the case go. He wrote letters. He testified before Army review boards. He gave interviews. He compiled witness statements from surviving members of the platoon. He died in October 1996, 90 days before the medal was finally awarded. His widow attended the White House ceremony in his place. Williams never met Patton. He never spoke with him. But the principle that drove him to fight for 53 years to get his sergeant the recognition he deserved was the same principle Patton had enforced on a frozen road in 1944. The code applies to everyone wearing the uniform. No exceptions. No delays. No quiet absorption. Williams had absorbed that lesson somewhere in the long winter of the Bulge, and he had carried it for the rest of his life. That is the legacy. Not the medals late or otherwise. Not the citations deferred for decades. The legacy is the principle itself passed from one soldier to another across half a century, refusing to die. From a salute refused on a muddy road in Lorraine, to a tank battalion that fought 183 consecutive days to a Medal of Honor, finally awarded 53 years late to an executive order that integrated the most powerful military in the world. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion proved that courage does not check the color of the man holding the rifle, and that an institution built on hierarchy can only survive when its hierarchy applies to everyone. Because of what they did. Over 3 million African Americans have since served in an integrated military that helped reshape American society itself. That is the power of a single act of enforcement performed without ceremony in front of witnesses who never forgot what they saw. If you know a story like this, a moment when one person with authority chose to enforce the rules instead of letting them slide, share it in the comments. There are hundreds of these moments scattered across the history of the Second World War, and most of them have never been told. Subscribe for more stories the textbooks left out. And remember this: an institution is only as just as its highest authority is willing to be on the smallest occasion. That is the lesson George Patton taught the United States Army on a cold morning in December 1944. And it is still the only lesson that matters.